Greetings, game changers. It's time for week 3 when the culture conflicts with God's live video demonstration. So I'm going to briefly walk you through the way that I would teach this lesson to a live audience. I'm going to give you the 3 major areas that we're going to cover. And then I'm going to show you how I use the handouts and use the discussion to engage the youth to have a conversation about God and cultural conflicts. So, as you know, I like pop quizzes, so I jump right in with the pop quiz. It's kind of a medium-sized pop quiz, intermediate level difficulty, but I ask the young people from the get-go, if you could have a private audience with God and you could ask him any question that you would want to ask, what would you ask him? What would be that private, intimate conversation you would want to have with God about a question that's in the back of your mind or lingering on your heart? And I allow them to share with the group what that question would be. We don't discuss it. We don't try to answer it. I just want to give them permission to look within themselves and share a question that they would have. And I've shared many of my questions because I'm always the guinea pig. And one of my questions that I wanted to ask God was, if you wanted us to get along, why did you make everyone so different? We've got different personalities, we've got different languages, we've got different lifestyles, and it's difficult to mesh with other people who are so different from you. And then I share with them, because God's answer was surprising but comforting. And what God said to me when I said, why did you make us so different? He said to me, you are different than me, Verdi, and I love you anyway, so just love people who are different from you anyway. And don't worry about how different they are, just love them to the degree that you can anyway. So the questions that come from the group are profound, and they allow us as the game changers to get inside of their heads and see the kinds of things they struggle with. And you'll be surprised, but you'll be inside of their head and you'll have an opportunity to hear what they think about in some of those quiet moments that they may or may not share. Because one of the things I've learned is youth don't share difficult, personal, sensitive questions if they don't feel safe. If they feel like they will be judged, they're not going to share, they're not going to open up. They may give you something, but they won't go deep. But when they feel safe, they will go deep and they will share, especially with other peers who are likewise sharing. So that's how we start the lesson. But then we move into a deeper question, and that question is, does God still speak to people? And they may not ever been asked that question. They know the Bible was written. They know the stories and the incidents and the people and the characters and the challenges throughout the history of the Bible, but we're talking about today. We're not talking about what was written in the Bible. And the question is, do you believe God still speaks? And once they answer that question and we discuss it, then I ask them, but who does God speak to? Does God speak to everyone? Does God speak to you? Does God speak to your classmates, your parents, children, only adults? And I want them to begin to process whether or not they believe that God still speaks, and then I take them to the Bible. And I talk to them about the sheep, and the sheep who followed the shepherd and knew and heard the shepherd's voice. And I really give them details about shepherds and sheepfolds and calling sheep out of the pen, because I really want them to understand this analogy that God uses in the Bible to describe who our shepherd is and how he leads us and protects us and speaks to us, it's not a coincidence at all. It's a very detailed lesson about sheep and the shepherds. And then I take them a little deeper once we can discuss whether God speaks to everyone. Then I want to zone in on children, because we're talking to young people. We're talking to young people who haven't experienced very many things in life. And sometimes children don't get the same respect and don't get the same, how do I want to say it, encouragement to seek God, to listen for God's voice, and to hear him, because they are children or youth or young adults. So I take them to the Bible again, and I talk about Samuel in the temple. And I want them to know that Samuel was a young boy. And then I throw in Jeremiah and what God said to Jeremiah as a teenager. And I lead them step by step to understand that God not only is still speaking, and not just to pastors and teachers and the elders and the deacons, but he wants to speak to young people, young youth, young adults, and even children. But we have to be taught to know and hear God's voice. And I give them an example. If you're in a mall, if you're in a crowded place, and your parent calls your name, there's a good chance that you will recognize your parent's voice because you've heard them call your name or talk to you frequently. Well, God's voice is the same way. The more we hear it, the more we recognize it, and the more we can respond to it, knowing that that's God speaking to us. So I walk them through those stages so they understand that God will speak, and God wants to speak to them personally, because his voice is important when we have a challenge between what the culture is teaching and leading us to believe and what God says in his word. And we have to begin to navigate those challenges, because we can talk about sin and what that means to God, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson. But we can also just talk about the challenges that we face in culture in terms what people do and how they do it and what they do to each other. And we can just look at some topics like, bullying. How do you feel about a situation where someone you know is bullied? And what would you do, and what would the culture tell you to do, and what would God tell you to do? Drug use. What does the culture tell us about drug use? What is the trend and the trajectory that we see developing and occurring around the use of drugs? Abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. What does the culture teach us about how women and children should be respected versus how people are pawns and tools for pleasure and satisfaction, depending on who's in power and who has the control? Suicide. What does the culture teach us about suicide versus what do we believe God teaches us about suicide? And the topics go on and on and on. Racism, abortion, oppression. We can go on and on and on. But they have to begin to understand that the culture and God have been in conflict since the beginning. This is not new. God talked about the conflict in the world and the sin and the disobedience in the beginning of the Bible. And that's not a new phenomenon. That hasn't changed, but we still have to learn to navigate it as youth, as young adults, as old adults, because the conflicts have only expanded. They've only become more pronounced and more pervasive. And we have to figure out, what do we do when there's a conflict? Well, part 3. I asked them to determine for themselves, is there someone who they consider an absolute authority on life? Pause. Ponder. Parents? Pastors? Teachers? Entertainers? Athletes? Politicians? But they've got to determine if there is someone that they consider an absolute authority, and what do they do when that absolute authority's truth is conflicted by everybody else on their list? They've got to figure out, how do they decide? How do they make that decision? And then I take them back to the previous lesson, who is God? Because that's the question that they have to ask themselves. And once they ask themselves, once they answer the question, who is God, then they have to then ask themselves, is God an absolute authority? And then what do you do in the face of that absolute authority's truth, instruction, wisdom, conflicting with the culture? And the conflicts, as I said, are as old as time, but they continue, and the young people must address those questions. And remember, I've got a handout that I give them an opportunity to look at some choices and determine why or why not they would choose that choice as an absolute authority, and then follow them. But then make decisions consistent with who they believe absolute authorities are. And if they don't believe there's an absolute authority, then I challenge them to figure out, well, then how do you make those decisions? And what do you base those decisions on? And how do those decisions change based upon where you are and what's going on around you? Because I said in the beginning, we're different. And what we do in America is not the same as what we might do in another culture. Or what we might do in this family is not what my family does. And we have to have some way to decipher the questions and the challenges that are presented by the culture. So I end this lesson by reminding them that they're continuously learning. And as they learn, because this is week 3, level 3, as they learn, they continue to grow. And they apply the skills, and they apply the knowledge, and they apply the tools that they are gaining to be able to make those difficult choices when the culture and God conflict. And again, I don't want to choose for them. But I want to give them enough information that they can make the choice and then live with that choice and the consequences. And game changers. I don't want to condemn them because they don't make the choice I want them to make. But I want to take them back to the previous lessons that say, just like video games, there are consequences for the choices that I make in the game of life, and I will surrender and win or explode and lose based upon those choices and decisions that I make. So enjoy lesson 3. The information is rich. The young people will dive in as long as you make it safe for them to open up, and you will learn as they learn. So continue your journey with the young people. I so thank you for your commitment. And I trust that you are watching them learn and grow right before your very eyes, and that you likewise are learning and growing as well. Take care.